Hi everybody, my name is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and in this video I'm answering questions. This question is, well, it says, assuming you have dabbed in or solved this one, what is the best approach or approaches for bass management of a 2.1 or 2.2 or 2.x stereo-only setup using stereo-only gear, i.e. that therefore doesn't have a preamp with built-in bass management? Do you do mains full frequency and then a technique to blend in subwoofers? Blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to get into all that. Well, this is an interesting question. So first thing I'll mention is stereo gear not having bass management is not a given. There is lots of stereo gear out there that does have bass management. And so I would start by saying, if I was doing this and I was trying to optimize the system, I would want bass management capabilities. And so I might look for a 2-channel preamp that has that. So Parasound has that. NAD actually has a new product that's come out with that. You can also do that through mini DSP products. And so there are ways to do bass management with a 2-channel system, and that would be preferable. But let's just pretend for a moment that we've got a more purist type system, but we're trying to blend in subwoofers. I think the answer that I would give you is I would run signal to the main amp and I would Y off to the subwoofers themselves. My preference in such a system would be balanced, and so we'd be doing XLRs to both. Some systems have the extra set of outputs for that, some do not. Some subwoofers have the ability to loop out to your amp, some amps have the ability to loop out to your subs. So you would do that however you need to do that. But a Y adapter would probably work fine, shouldn't cause any issues. Now, let me just start by saying 0.1 refers to the LFE channel. In a stereo system, there's no 0.1. It's not an LFE channel. You're simply trying to do something with the bass. So you could bass manage. If the subwoofer has internal bass management capabilities, you could go into the subwoofer and then out to your main amp, which goes out to your speakers. The other option is you could kind of parallel it. And so there was this discussion of, well, what if you run the mains full range and then the subs are blended in? It's a little trickier to do that right, but it's actually in many cases a better way if the main speakers can handle it. So the whole reason for bass management, which was done with movies, was that movies needed to hit reference levels. Reference levels are fairly loud, but it was the levels that were deemed appropriate for movie reproduction in a large cinema house. And so in a home, you're going to listen to music at fairly realistic levels. That too will be pretty loud. Your speakers may not be able to reproduce that in the bass. The subwoofers can. And so you don't want your speakers overloading, and then you need the subwoofers to take up the slack. And so you have to bass manage your speakers there too. It also is better with amplifier power because you take off a load from the amp. But without any sort of bass management, your only option really is going to be to have them paralleled with each other. And that still helps because the subwoofers still have much more dynamic range than the speakers do, and to get that kind of elevation in bass, you can do that by just turning up the level of the subwoofer a bit. To get it all to blend well, though, is really tricky. The easiest solution is to keep the subwoofers as co-located to those speakers as possible, but you run into a problem, which is that frequently when you do that, those subwoofers then are not in a good location for optimal bass reproduction. Because the way they excite the modes, first off, you're going to be having SBIR effects, so that's speaker boundary interference response problems, where it's going to wrap around the sub and go back to the rear wall there, but not rear wall, front wall behind the subwoofer though, and come back, and it interferes with itself. It's going to hit the sidewall and interfere with itself. So that's not ideal. So really you want to push the subwoofers up against a boundary. The other benefit of pushing it against the boundary is you get boundary gain. You get extra reinforcement of the low frequencies, and you get some extra efficiency. So one thing you could do is you could place them at precise locations. Corners will excite the room most evenly. You get the most modal excitation from that. And if you have enough subwoofers, a minimum of 2, but 4, let's say, in each corner, even in a stereo system, you could get potentially some pretty good results. And often many modern subwoofers have built-in EQ and low-pass filters and everything else so that you can get it all optimized. You could inset them to, I think it's the 1/3 location. I think I have that right. So 1/3 in excites less modes, so the width modes are not excited. And you're still exciting the same height modes, you're still exciting the same length modes, but there's a lot less of those width modes, and so you're minimizing some of those problems. That can be a good thing to try. What I would tell you, and it's what I do when I'm setting up a system like that, is I just try different things, if I even have that flexibility. It's not uncommon that the subwoofers just have to go somewhere and I don't have a lot of flexibility. So typically I would push them back against the front wall wherever I can fit them. Corners is a common location, but not always where they can go. From there, I just play around with the settings that the subwoofer gives me, the low pass filter, the 0 and 180 degree polarity switch, and the phase. And think of the 0, 180 and the phase as interrelated things. One is a full 180 degrees, and then the other one is like a fine tuning. And then the next issue you've got is getting it all to blend well. So those are the tools you're going to use to do it, but like, how do you do that? So there are people out there who will say, oh, I do it by ear. Well, good luck. That's really difficult, and quite frankly, I would love to see somebody who does it by ear and gets good results. And by good, I mean it measures well. So I do it with measurements. And I typically use the same tools I would use for a surround system. So something like REW, microphones around the listening position, take measurements, and then I keep playing with it till I get it right. And what I do is I look for clues. I mean, one of the things you can do is you can actually measure the left speaker on its own, measure the right speaker on its own, measure the left subwoofer on its own, measure the right subwoofer on its own, or maybe you only have one sub, so just measure the subwoofer on its own. You go into something like REW, which has an alignment tool. You don't provide any sort of high passing and low passing. You leave it as is, which the alignment tool allows, and then you can do phase align at a certain frequency range. And you can see what that does at the overall response. And then you can play around with the time delay to see if there's a particular point at which it's optimal. Now you may look at that and say, there's no optimal point. I'm getting it good at a certain range, but it's canceling at another. Play around with the phase. Try 180 degrees of polarity, and then play around with the phase again and see if you can get it right. And if you can't under any circumstance, and I've had that happen before, sometimes you go back to the only solution is going to be proper bass management. Sometimes, you've got maybe a sealed subwoofer, you got ported tower speakers, you can't high pass them, you're trying to get it to be optimally aligned, and it's not happening, it's not going to happen. What do? As I said, there aren't a lot of options, and so what I've typically done is, in those situations, got it as good as I can get it, or try to implement some sort of bass management through another means. And so anyway, that's what I typically do. Again, there's no difference between stereo and surround sound bass reproduction. The bass reproduction issues are the same. The only difference is that, yes, the tools you have often are less. You can use mini DSP. Do understand mini DSP introduces latency. And so if you use something like a flex, my recommendation is to make sure that the left and the right channels come off the flex, the flex is a better sounding one, so it's not going to introduce any detriment to the sound. That way the latency is fixed, and the subwoofers and the mains have the latency all inherent in them. If you have the flex only go to the subwoofers, and then the left and the right speakers go off of the preamp itself directly, you've built in time delay into the subwoofers you can't compensate for. It's not fixable, and while you may be able to get a good phase aligned response, you're never going to get a good time aligned response. So if you're going to do the flex, make sure you're connecting all of the speakers and subwoofers together onto the flex. EQing. So you're going to use the same approach as you do with anything else. You're going to EQ it until the response is nice and smooth and consistent across your seated area. You're going to use tools like MSO or REW's own EQ tools if that's the direction you want to go, until you get something that makes sense. You're just going to be limited. If you're using a mini DSP flex, you can use that. That's going to give you a ton of tools. But if you don't want to do that, it doesn't fit what you're doing, my recommendation is to buy a subwoofer that has EQ capabilities built into it. Of the ones that I carry, Perlisten's got an app, and the app lets you set EQ filters, so that's a nice way of doing that. Those subwoofers are as audiophile as it gets. The sound quality is excellent on those, and so you can blend those with whatever speakers you want to blend them with, and then their own inherent DSP gives you a lot of capabilities. In terms of level, that's subjective. You set it the way you want it. So I hope that helps. That's the approach that I've used. There's no reason why you cannot blend subwoofers in with your speakers. Oh, you know what? I'm not going to end the video here. I'm sure some of you are saying, what about stereo versus mono bass? So for most modern pop music, probably mono bass is going to be a given, in which case having the subs go mono is fine. I will say for a dedicated 2-channel system, I probably would set up the subwoofers as stereo. And the reason is for a lot of natural music recorded correctly, there is actually some benefit to having stereo separation in the bass. No, you're not going to hear low frequency pans across the room. That doesn't exist, that's not a thing. But our sense of envelopment and spaciousness is affected by the phase differences in the low frequencies. And so when bass is, essentially it's the low frequency content of reverb, natural real reverb in a room. And there are reverb devices from, for instance, Lexicon that actually reproduce it correctly in that way. So in the case of pop music that was actually recorded with this intent, not very common, but it does exist. Queen apparently is one of them. Or in the case of certain kinds of natural recordings, so symphony recordings, not all of them, particular ones. I believe the ORTF microphone arrangement is one of the ones that works for this, but don't quote me on that. We should probably I'll do another video maybe where we cover this concept of spaciousness, spatial information. So we've got that. You've got jazz recordings and other things that are often done in the natural music. All of that will have this content in there, and so doing stereo bass in that scenario is pretty valuable. In this case, though, I would probably make an adjustment. Being able to hear that effect is very difficult, and it's a subtle effect. And so my recommendation is actually put the subwoofers on either side of you instead of up in the front. My experience, you can try different things and see what works best for you. My experience was that when you had high lateral separation, like one on the left wall, one on the right wall, basically on either side of me, that was when I found the effect to be most readily perceptible, and so that was my recommendation as a way to go. So I hope this is helpful. This is my way of doing 2-channel bass. As I said, there's lots of options, and play around, see what you get. Keep watching, subscribe to my channel. There's more videos coming.